What's up guys, Vress here, and today I want to talk about whether World of Warcraft is worth returning to in 2018. This video may be useful for totally new players as well, but we'll be looking at everything from a returning player's perspective, and I will be assuming a basic understanding of the game. I will however follow this up with a video that's focused entirely on totally new players, so keep an eye out for that. I'm going to keep things at a fairly high level as this is intended as an overview video, and a deep dive into every key feature could take hours. Instead, we're going to take a simple approach and just list the pros and cons, which will hopefully give you an understanding as to whether you're going to enjoy the game in its current state. As always, this video is based on my own personal opinions, and I'm not trying to claim that everyone feels the same way. Personally, I feel that Legion has been a pretty decent expansion, if a little hit and miss at times. However, when I start feeling down on Legion, I just remember Warlords of Draenor, and I immediately find new appreciation for the current expansion. So essentially that's the perspective I'm coming from, and it's obviously worth bearing that in mind, though I do promise to be just as honest about the cons as I am about the pros. Anyway, enough chit chat, let's get into this, starting with the pros. The most obvious reason that people will return to WoW in 2018 is the fact that it's an expansion year. Battle for Azeroth will likely launch at some point during Q3 or Q4 of this year. This expansion is going to take World of Warcraft back to its roots with the war between the Alliance and the Horde. Now I'm not going to spoil the story behind this as you may not have played Legion at this point. However, I would definitely suggest at least playing through the story in Legion if you're thinking about picking up Battle for Azeroth. You're just going to get a better understanding of what the hell is going on and why the factions are at each other's throats again. Aside from this renewed focus on the war between Horde and Alliance, Battle for Azeroth will also bring new features such as 2 new continents, Zandalar and Kulturas, a host of new playable races, brand new game modes such as Warfronts and Uncharted Islands, as well as plenty more. We don't have time in this video to go into detail on the expansion, but I'll link my expansion overview video in the description down below. Just a little disclaimer though, I actually listed Warfronts as a PvP feature in that video, as I misinterpreted it when it was announced. As far as we know, it's actually a PvE only feature, at least for now. Of course, we have quite a while to wait for the new expansion, so what makes Legion worth playing in the meantime? First up, we have the fact that it's now easier than ever to level up in WoW and learn the basics. Yes, this does make the leveling experience less challenging, and we're going to talk about that in the cons section. However, this could actually be quite useful to you as a returning player, especially if you just want to play endgame or are trying to catch up with your friends, who will likely be max level already. Abilities have been somewhat simplified and streamlined, and while some are not happy with that, there's no denying that it's now easier to get a grasp of the basics. Leveling's also about to undergo some big changes, which will hopefully make it a far more enjoyable experience. If you've come back in the last few years, you may have found that the leveling experience felt kind of disjointed. You essentially outlevel a zone before you even get to begin enjoying its storyline, and therefore leveling just feels like a mess. However, new zone scaling is coming into effect with patch 7.3.5, and you will actually get to spend a lot more time enjoying each zone as you level. Obviously, you still won't be able to play all of them as you'll still gain experience at the same rate, but at least you'll be able to fully experience the ones that you do decide to focus on. For example, if you missed the Burning Crusade, then you could choose to play through it from level 60 to 80 and not find yourself out leveling the content so quickly. Another thing that's improved over the years is the game's storytelling. Once you hit the more recent expansions, you'll find a lot more in the way of cutscenes and voice acted quest lines. This makes the story far more engaging, at least in my opinion. Now, don't get me wrong, WoW is still not the best MMO around when it comes to storytelling, but it's definitely improved since the early days, and it's nice to have a main thread to follow. I've enjoyed Warcraft lore since playing the RTS series, and I've been happy to see more and more of that lore being pulled into the main storyline. And I've got a feeling that as a returning player, you might enjoy that too. Content pacing has also been far better in Legion than it has been in previous expansions. The great content drought that we saw in Warlords of Draenor has not been repeated, at least not yet. We've been seeing far more significant patches this expansion that have continued to progress the storyline and add healthy amounts of new content for us to experience. Sure, if you're a hardcore player and you're spending a lot of time in the game, then you'll eventually run out of content to consume. However, for the vast majority of us, I feel it's pretty difficult to exhaust everything that Legion has to offer. If you're looking for challenging endgame content, then I don't think you'll be disappointed with Legion. People often talk about how endgame was so much more difficult back in vanilla, but I'm not sure that those who say that actually played back then. Yes, it was hard in the sense that pulling a 40-man group together was something of a logistical nightmare, and raids often required long attunements and very specific equipment to even get started. However, once you were in the raid, the mechanics themselves were actually quite basic compared to Legion standards. The big difference being that we all sucked at mechanics back then and therefore found it far more challenging. To be honest, some of us still suck, and I know that serious players are laughing at my rotation right now. I took a break and I'm rusty, okay? Legion offers different raid tiers in order to allow everyone to enjoy the content. However, if it's a challenge you want, then you should check out Mythic raids as well as Mythic Plus dungeons. The cool thing about Mythic Plus dungeons is that they keep scaling, so you'll always have a challenge ahead of you regardless of how good your gear becomes. You simply can't outscale Mythic Plus dungeons like you can with most other content, and this is hands down one of the best features that came with Legion in my opinion. If you're a classic player, then you'll know what I'm talking about when I say that balancing is far better in the current game than it was in the past. I know that someone's going to rage in the comments about the game not being balanced. However, relatively speaking, the game is incredibly well balanced compared to what you may have experienced as a player in years gone by. You probably remember back when we had some totally useless specs. And I'm not talking about lower than optimal DPS in raids, I mean almost totally useless, to the point that hardly anyone even bothered to play them. Elemental Shamans, Balance Druids and Survival Hunters all suffered this unless in the hands of a very skilled player with very good gear. Even then, they were significantly weaker than other specs with the equivalent skill and gear level. Now obviously, if you want to raid at the highest level, then you will be forced to follow the meta in order to maximise your output. And yes, this will lock you to certain specs, but for most other content you'll have far more flexibility. Another change that you might enjoy as a returning player is the fact that gear now has a significantly reduced impact on PvP. Long gone are the days of being rolled over by warriors in full Naxxramas gear without even having a chance to compete. Back then you could be the most skilled player around and still get your ass handed to you by someone with significantly better gear. These days gear has a far lesser impact, which will allow you to reach a competitive level faster than you would have done at some points in the past. Now notice that I deliberately said at some points in the past, as due to newly introduced artifact weapons and PvP talents, you actually still need to spend quite a bit of time to become viable in PvP. But we'll talk more about that in the cons section. The positive is that you have a chance of being somewhat competitive without having to have the best possible gear in game. Continuing on that same thread of not having to put silly amounts of time into becoming reasonably competitive, you may be happy to know that there are a lot more catch-up mechanics in game than there used to be. At the start of Legion, there were some features that made it seriously difficult to catch up with the rest of the pack. The most significant was how long it took to level up your artifact weapon, and this in my opinion was a massive pain in the ass. However, this has now been made significantly faster, and you won't have to go through quite the same amount of pain that the rest of us did, especially when it came to leveling our alts. I'm not saying that being able to get things faster is going to be a pro for everyone, but I know that it will be for some of you, particularly if you're more of a casual player. Speaking of benefits for casual players, there are also a lot of quality of life features that didn't exist back in the day. Travelling around the world is generally a lot faster than it used to be. This is due to the fact that there are a lot more flight points and opportunities to fast travel. Features like the group finder make it incredibly easy to get a dungeon group and even goes as far as teleporting you in and out of the instance. And pretty much the same feature exists for Battlegrounds in the lowest difficulty raid tier. Honestly, the game just runs a hell of a lot smoother than it used to if you don't have a lot of time on your hands. Personally, I do miss some of the old features, or maybe lack of features we should probably call it, as though even though they were a pain in the arse, I feel like they did encourage a more tightly knit in-game community. But that being said, there's no denying that it's far easier to get things done in modern WoW. Another reason to return to the game is the fact that there's just so much content to enjoy. This has always been the case with WoW, but even more so in recent years. A lot of additional activities have been added into the game, such as world quests, scalable dungeons, new PvP modes, new achievements, as well as things like pet battles and transmogging. Personally, I don't get hugely involved in a lot of the side activities such as pet collection and battles. But one thing I can pretty much guarantee about WoW is that unless you put a crazy amount of hours in, you're not going to run out of things to do. Finally, there have been some nice improvements to both graphics and animations over the years. Depending on when you last played, things may feel quite different, and while the game does look a bit dated, at least it's not still rocking the original models from 2004. Legion also introduced new character animations that have made the combat feel more fluid and enjoyable. Add to this the fact that new zones have become more graphically impressive with each expansion, and the end result is something that may surprise you if you haven't played in a while. Of course, it's not all plain sailing, and this wouldn't be a very objective discussion if I didn't talk about the cons. Like I said before, the fact that the game is much easier when leveling can be seen as a con just as much as it can be seen as a pro. Leveling can get pretty boring these days as there really isn't much of a challenge involved. If you played in some of the earlier expansions, then you'll remember that it was pretty easy to get yourself killed while leveling and exploring the open world. This isn't really the case anymore, especially when it comes to the lower level content. And while some players will enjoy this change of pace, I know that some of you may not like how easy leveling has become. This is particularly true of dungeons while leveling, which really don't present the level of difficulty that they did in the past. Also, as everything happens so quickly, you probably won't know enough to be competitive by the time you hit max level, even as a returning player. Like I said, there are clearly pros and cons to leveling being faster and easier. When it comes down to it, it's really just a matter of personal taste. Another thing that can really grate on you, to be honest with any MMO, not just World of Warcraft, is the feeling that things can get very repetitive. Now things are certainly better than they used to be, but there's still a pretty healthy element of repetitive grinding featured in the game. World quests can get pretty tedious after a while and don't offer a huge amount of variety, though to their credit they're still better than previous offerings from both WoW and other games in the genre. The same could be said about dungeons, which you'll probably end up grinding on a regular basis to stay competitive in terms of gear. To be fair though, this is the case with all MMOs if you really want to stay competitive, and it's no worse in WoW than anywhere else. However, I don't want you to return to the game thinking that there's not going to be any grinding or repetitive content involved. Next up, we have an issue that many people worry about when starting or returning to WoW, and that is the elitism that can be present in the existing player base. I won't lie to you, it's definitely there. People can be extremely toxic if you don't know what you're doing in a dungeon or battleground. This is probably due to the fact that a lot of people have been playing this game for a very long time, and unfortunately some of these people are not mature enough to realise that they're taking that knowledge for granted. However, you do have the very handy /ignore command to deal with these players, and nothing annoys them more than simply ignoring them. My advice is to find a guild that's friendly towards new or returning players, and when you do, I think you'll find that your game experience will change dramatically. On the subject of guilds, it's fairly easy to find a friendly guild while leveling. However, it can be quite difficult to find a guild that will accept new or returning players for serious endgame content. And that's not necessarily due to elitism either. The reality is, it's just not that viable for endgame guilds to take players that they have to train up, especially when there are so many experienced players to pick from. Not all guilds are going to be willing to take a chance on you. However, if you take some time to search on the WoW forums as well as on Facebook groups and subreddits, then you should be able to find a guild that's willing to take on less experienced players. Sure, they might not be deep into mythic raiding, but what's quite cool is that you'll get the opportunity to be a vital part of getting them there, rather than just being carried. Something that I personally miss about the old days of WoW is the sense of community that existed at a realm level. Sadly, this is mostly gone and it probably won't ever come back. At least not unless you're willing to play on classic servers when they launch. Realm communities have slowly dispersed, mostly due to server merges and some of the quality of life features that have been implemented. You no longer need to have a good reputation on your server or spend time talking to other players in order to find a group for a dungeon. Of course, this has made things a lot faster and easier, but we did inevitably lose some of the benefits of having close-knit realm communities. There's also a bit less of a focus on the world itself in current WoW, at least in my opinion. A large number of areas are pretty dead and you only really pass through them briefly while leveling. This is of course unavoidable as people don't have much of a reason to go back to old content, and to be honest, I don't really think there's much that can be done about that. The focus is generally on the areas of the world that have been introduced with whichever expansion is current at the time. I think flying has also contributed to this feeling of emptiness in the world, as we're mostly just cruising around at high altitudes rather than bumping into each other on the ground. There's also an even bigger focus on instance content than there was in the past, though admittedly WoW has always been a pretty instance focused game. Like I said, this is something that can't really be helped when you have an older game that's introduced so much content over the years. But basically what I'm trying to say is don't come back expecting the world to be the way it was in the early days. It's just a different experience now. Moving on to the issue of grind and RNG. Like I said, this has mostly been fixed with catch-up mechanics and the ability to purchase specific legendaries rather than relying on random drops. Obviously there are still some elements of RNG in the game, but it's not nearly half as bad as it was, and to be honest, I didn't really have a huge problem with some form of RNG in the first place. I mean, it does make items feel a hell of a lot more special when they actually do drop. I wanted to address this issue in the cons section and be clear about the fact that it's been mostly resolved, as you're definitely going to see this listed as a con in older videos and posts, and context is really important. Now, I listed the fact that the game's graphics have improved as a pro for you as a returning player. However, that's only because you've played the game in an earlier form, and it's only fair to point out that in the context of more recently released titles, the graphics in WoW do look pretty dated. To be fair, there's only so much that you can do to improve the graphics of an older title, and while Blizzard have done a pretty good job of this, it obviously doesn't look as good as some of the more recent releases. This final one is more of a warning than a con. World of Warcraft can be insanely addictive, and there's always the chance that you might end up like this guy. So don't say I didn't warn you. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our list. In summary, the pros are, there's a new expansion coming out, it's easier than ever to level and learn the basics, we've seen some drastically improved storytelling, content pacing is better than ever, there's plenty of challenging endgame to enjoy, there's better balancing than we've seen in the past, gear is far less impactful on PvP, there are plenty of catch-up mechanics in place so you don't get too far behind, there are a load of quality of life features implemented to save you time, there's stacks to do as always in World of Warcraft, and we've seen some nice improvements to graphics and animations. In terms of the cons, it is a little bit too easy to level, and that can get kind of boring for some people. As with any MMO, there is an element of repetitive content. Unfortunately, there is some elitism in the community. It can be difficult to get a place in endgame guilds as a new or returning player. We've kind of lost the realm communities we had in the old days. There's a bit less focus on the world itself. There were some serious issues of RNG which have mostly now been addressed and fixed. In the wider context of current games, the graphics are pretty dated, and of course you might get yourself addicted. Overall, I still think World of Warcraft's an awesome game, and I'll be playing it for years to come. Though obviously this is only my opinion, and I'm looking forward to hearing yours in the comments down below. Also, if you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to my channel for regular content. Additionally, I've recently set up a Patreon page if you want to be extra awesome and support me on there as well. Either way, take care of yourself, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.